I find it very fascinating. Joining us right now to discuss this article is Dr. Derek Taylor. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Praise be to God. Thank you for your time. We're very grateful to have you on the show today. Now, it is an interesting question because the church does seem quite split on the issue. Half of us believe everything the Pope says is therefore fiat. No matter what it is, he's the Pope, who am I? And the other half are like, is he even the Pope? I mean, like, we are definitely seeing a divided church today. What say you, Dr. Derek Taylor?
Yeah, it's kind of part of the reason I wrote that article is that, again, I'm not accusing your average Catholic who says that, well, you must obey the Pope in every single thing. That most Catholics are just, they go to church, they do the best they can. I have no real qualm with them, but I think they're being misled by people who look, there are certain things the Pope can't do. There are limits to his authority. It's very grand. I'm a convert to the faith, an adult convert. One of the reasons I converted was the papacy. I love the fact that it has this great authority, but that authority is meant to preserve what was handed on to it, not just contradict, whatever a current pope thinks should be contradicted, or what his supporters should think should be contradicted. And so that's all I was trying to clarify that for the people. Is like, no, this really isn't. This has roots in the past, but plus I've had this. Everybody's had this conversation. I think you talk to somebody about something Pope Francis has said, and somebody will tell me. I've heard educated people tell me, educated Catholics, well, he was chosen by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah,
right? But the conclave was absolutely infallible. I'm like, that's not true. I don't know. I was really like disturbed. Where does that come from? And once you read, that where that comes from is an abuse of that idea of his infallibility. And so it kind of gets connected to things it has nothing to do with, really. So.
I'm a convert myself, and when I came into the church, I would say I had a very simplistic view. I felt like just on the surface, after considering the arguments, I gotta say, Patrick Madrid's Pope Fiction was a real defining moment for me. Reading his book, Pope Fiction, helped me to undo a lot of myths and misconceptions about the papacy for me as a Protestant considering the Catholic arguments. But yet, I felt like I'm like, okay, I've given my heart to the church, so the Pope's good, everything's good, and I couldn't fathom the idea. Even though I read Patrick's book, which did include bad popes, I couldn't fathom the idea of okay, that was way back then, but that's all over with now, and everybody's good these days. Like, I couldn't fathom the complexity of the human personality who has to sit in the chair of St. Peter.
Well, one of the things, and this is something I've thought about a lot, is that, since the Reformation, the church has been very careful about who gets elected pope. Yeah, when you think about it, there hasn't been, this is the thing about with Pope Francis, the whole Theodore McCarrick question. I don't think there's been a moral question about a pope like that since before the Reformation. We've been very fortunate in the modern era to not have to worry about that. But that was going to happen at some point anyway. Like, there was just no. But again, we're actually blessed that the modern era, you never had any question about popes like that. But again, in the medieval era, you had questions about pope and their teaching occasionally. So it has happened, and but you don't think you're going to live through it because hey, we've gotten through all that, and history. We should move on for that, but history doesn't move on. It's always possible, unfortunately. We just have to live through it.
Dr. Derek Taylor, I was just thinking about the fact that, it's so dangerous now because, like you're saying in your article, there is an element where you start saying things like, oh, yes, the Pope is the oracle of God and everything he says is inspired. And obviously that's not true. But then, like Joe was saying, the danger becomes you might flip onto the other side. And I was first brought to this this idea of the true looking at the papacy with real eyes through Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira with the TFP. in his declaration of resistance. He says, "The church is not, and the church never was, and the church never will be such a prison for consciousness. The bond of obedience to the successor of Peter, which we will never break, which we venerate in the most profound depths of our souls, and to which we tribute our highest love. This bond we kiss at the very moment in which, overwhelmed with sorrow, we affirm our position, and on our knees, respectfully looking at the figure of His Holiness Pope Paul VI, we express our fidelity to the papacy. In this filial act, we say to the pastor of pastors, our soul is yours, our life is yours. Order us to do whatever you desire. Only do not order us to do nothing in the face of the attacking red wolf. To this, our conscience is opposed," and then gives the explanation of his act of recognize and resist. And that really struck me as, okay, well, you can have a love for the papacy, a love for the current reigning pontiff, and yet you can resist whenever he is violating your well-formed conscience. What say you?
Yeah, that's about. I mean, that's the correct thing, is that you have to be clear you're doing this because it's easy for people who they feel betrayed, right? And they get angry. And I've gone through this. You can let that anger really warp your mind. And if you go down that route, yeah, you can fall away from the faith. And so it's a difficult thing morally and intellectually to deal with. And that's, again, part of the reason I wrote the essay, was to give people like, hey, look, you're not crazy. You're not crazy. Something's wrong here. But it is not necessarily without precedent. And that statement you mentioned was actually very good. Like, you impose in conscience, you do it because you sincerely believe this is true and not that. And not because I know people who've they let it go. They let themselves go emotionally. Their passions go, and it just turns to hate. And like, it's a bad thing. I always have to keep charity. Charity is the first. Charity to me is like an intellectual virtue, because you can't think clearly if you're violently hating towards someone.
And as I said at the top of the conversation, ultramontane means over the mountains. It has its historical roots in going over the mountains to seek clarification from the Pope, and that's sort of the trend grew. And of course, it goes all the way back, right? I mean, you go back to the earliest church in the first century. Like, it was like the third Pope wrote a letter to the Corinthians, like Clement of Rome, and he's like, "Listen, you Corinthians, there's a reason why St. Paul is smacking you upside the head, you knucklehead." I mean, so what gave him the right, the authority to do so? He certainly felt he had that as being the successor of Peter. So it's not like it was invented in the Protestant Reformation. But it was this ultramontane controversy did get to a somewhat of a fevered pitch during Vatican I. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, that's what happened. And I point this out in the article, is that people had made, not just reasoned claims for the exalted power of the papacy in the past, but they'd made rhetorical claims that were kind of crazy in the Middle Ages and stuff like this. But it was always between elites. It was always among the educated. What happens in the 19th century that's very different is that for the first time you have the printing press, right? That can reach a mass audience, and you have these news people who create the sort of first popular Catholic press that tries to reach the masses. And one of the people I mentioned there is very famous. His name's Louis Vuillot, and he's a Frenchman. And he actually did some good for the church. He actually did some good things, but the rhetoric he used in the run-up to Vatican I to try to basically destroy opposition to the definition of papal fallibility within the church. I list some of that stuff in the article. It's insane. I mean, if you take it literally, it's idolatry. It's just straight up, like, people were referring to the Pope as the vice god on earth. There's a nice quotation in there from Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit journal, which I think the quote is, "Whenever the Pope meditates, it's God who is thinking directly through him." Again, this was meant to sort of demonize any opposition to this definition. And there were people who were good Catholics who were opposed to that definition. John Henry Newman is the most famous one. And he wasn't opposed to he believed that. He believed the things that Vatican I taught even before it taught it. He was worried about the context of it, whether it was the right time for it and all that stuff. In fact, I didn't mention this in the article. Actually, Pius IX wasn't convinced this was the right thing to do. His advisors were very they were very extreme, and they basically sort of convinced him to do this, to call the council for that reason. The documents of Vatican I, I think, are for the most part great, actually. So I'm not casting any aspersions on them. But the rhetoric that sort of sold this to the Catholic population, it could be like the stuff I quoted in the article. It's crazy. When I first read it, my eyeballs went. I'm like, this is nuts. And I think that's where you get a lot of this exaggeration coming from in the modern era, is just, mass media is very powerful. And a lot of times, even in the 19th century, Pius IX, he passed away. After his death, Leo the 13th tried to put the clamps on some of those ultramontane newspapers because they were so extreme. Even though Leo the 13th was a great pope, he was, perfect orthodox and everything. So yeah, that's really what does it, and that makes it different in the modern era.
Yeah, there seems to be an echo there, with the printing press, development of the printing press, came the accessibility of different documents. People were able to receive all kinds of different things and read different opinions and all that sort of stuff. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the modern era, though. Now technology is so widespread. We have just the world in our pocket, really, in our cell phones. How do you think that this concept is reborn in our modern society today, with so much technology and the capacity to have conversations like we're having, really instantaneously?
It's kind of this. It's weird. There's a lot of continuity because it's different. Like 100 years ago, it's vastly different. But in some ways, it's similar because it's just much more powerful technology. It's just instantaneous. The same, I did my graduate work, my dissertation was on, pamphleteering in the 17th century. And even you go back that far, the promise of the printing press, or the promise of modern media is, okay, you have the chance to disseminate information more widely. The problem is you can disseminate false information more widely. That's the whole idea of fake news, right? Like you can in the ancient world, if you wanted to damage someone's reputation, or if you wanted to, for example, the ancient Roman Empire, they would do something called, what modern historians call the damnatio memoriae. They would take your name off of all the public buildings, strike your name from records. Records were so scarce back then, you could do that. Well, you can't do that now. Well, what you can do is perpetuate a false narrative over and over again. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and that was the point I was kind of trying to make in the essay. Is like it's something you have to be careful with, and even in this pontificate, you'd had the papacy complaining about right-wing websites and all this other stuff, and like that's just something you have to deal with if you're the papacy. You can't control ultimately the image you put out there. You're going to have people trying to sort of undermine that one way or the other, and that's been the case since at least the Reformation, right? Because the Reformation did that too. The printing press was essential to that. It's just something we had to deal with. We don't have much choice.
Just as a follow-up to that, I'm wondering if I could get your take on this, because this is something that I've thought about, and maybe it's not just a coincidence, right? Well, there's a rise in Catholic commentators today. Like, you can think of big names like Taylor Marshall, RTF, et cetera, et cetera. They do have a lot of influence, mostly for good, I would say. And I think that there is sort of a group of people in the Vatican who pay attention to this sort of stuff. And I'm just wondering, do you think that because of the rise of big Catholic commentators who really criticize the papacy, rightfully so, do you think that has created the sort of response that the Vatican has against traditionalists, like Traditionis Custodes, like putting that out and that sort of thing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, at least in part. I mean, most of the I did mention this in my essay. There's been other places, but the biggest pushback toward this papacy, some of its more questionable aspects, has come from the United States. So, and that's where we have a big, huge media presence. That thing is, in the United States, we have more money, so we have time to go do all this stuff. And so that's one of the reasons I think traditionalism flourishes here. So, it takes some money to do the traditional mass and everything. We have that in the United States. But yeah, almost certainly. I think, I don't know how much they pay attention to it. I mean, it's weird that you think they wouldn't bother with like bloggers and stuff like that, or YouTube celebrities, but they do. And again, I go back to Leo the 13th. He did with all these newspapers in the 19th century. So they learned. Well, they learned because the press was a part of all these revolutions. The French Revolution, and they learned the press had power, and you had to pay attention to it. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's the case, because people like Taylor Marshall got millions of viewers on YouTube, and these people have influence.
I'm just thinking while you're saying that it's the thing that bothers me the most is the fact that I feel like I'm being, the term has become popular, being gaslit, right? Gaslighting. And so people are like, what? No, nothing's changed. No doctrine's been changed. It's like, and then I'm thinking most specifically of the death penalty. I got in trouble for talking about the death penalty in college. And they're like, no, you can't say that the death penalty is perfectly fine. That's against the church teaching. And I'm like, but the Pope used to have a papal executioner. But popes have executed people. But we promoted it. But it's in the Bible. And people are trying to tell me, and I'm just like confused. And it took me a while to actually understand what was going on. And so that push from the media to try to say, don't believe your lying eyes, that's what bothers me the most about this position, that the Pope's authority is over the doctrine, over Scripture, over everything else.
And that's one of the, there are people, especially the supporters of Francis, the media supporters, quite frankly, some of them are just very dishonest. They're just very dishonest.
Yeah, one of them passed away just recently.
What's that?
One of them just passed away recently, the atheist who... Scalafari. God help his soul.
That's the guy's name. And there are just people who do this, and it's just very, it's just... You wonder what goes through their mind, right? Like, you've got an agenda. And again, I've talked with very liberal people in the church who aren't like that. Like I think they're totally wrong. I think they're basically embracing it. They're not lying to me. Right. And that's the worst part, when you feel like someone's being intentionally dishonest.
The other aspect I think to this conversation I think is important to bring up is one could criticize what they see coming from statements from the Pope or what have you, and at the same time not hate him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we get lumped into these extremes. Like you must therefore hate everything and therefore burn the whole thing down. Like no, one could have great charity and love for a person and still call them out on these errors and these issues. And I think that's kind of where we're at with a lot of what comes out of the Vatican. It's like we love the church, we love Holy Mother Church, we want the best for Pope Francis, for the cardinals, for everybody involved, but at the same time, we just don't want error being taught.
That's the thing is and if you are, and because I've gone through this, I know people who've gone through this. You have to pray for these people. You have to pray for Pope Francis. You can't, and the reason I have to pray is at least partly for yourself. You can't really hate somebody if you're praying for them.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what God calls you to do anyway with anyone, and that's why it's a good thing to do. And you can't do it. It ceases to be legitimate criticism, and then it becomes something else if you do that. And so and look, most of the people I know, they're not hateful against him at all. They're just distressed that he's doing all this stuff.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You're right.
Lack of clarity is very confusing for these times. And the other thing too is like the biblical text that I go to discuss the role of the Pope in the church. You go back to the Old Testament, Isaiah 20, or you go Matthew 16, but you go to these other passages like Matthew 24 or whatever, and you realize it becomes clear that the Lord knew that he was going to have men that were going to be scandalous. They would beat the servants, but he would show up and he'd lay the law, and it would be the guy with the keys that'd be the most in trouble. So it's not like our Lord is deaf, dumb, or blind to what goes on in his church, because it's his. Taint theirs, right? Amen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Darrick Taylor, God bless you. Thank you for your time today. Check out his article at Crisis Magazine. The article is Has Modern Media Created the Ultramontane Papacy? We'll link to it on our live video feeds. And God bless you, Doctor. That's going to have a great be it for the first hour. If you can join us in the second hour, we'd love to have you. Brent Tain's going to catch us up on some pro-life news. We'll